Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Rita Chakrabarti. The headlines. The government is scrapping the COVID tracing app that's been testing on the Isle of Wight in favour of a system being used in other countries in what's being seen as a major U-turn. It comes as new data reveals contact tracers have been unable to contact more than a quarter of people who've tested positive for coronavirus in England. A further 135 people have died in the UK with coronavirus, taking the total to 42,288. Good news for the High Street in Scotland as the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announces that some shops can reopen from June the 29th. Northern Ireland reduces social distancing for school children to 1 metre.
Again, don't know where. Don't know when.
And our other main headline this afternoon, tributes are paid to the Forces sweetheart Dame Vera Lynn, who's died at the age of 103. Hello, good afternoon and welcome to viewers on BBC One. In around half an hour, we'll bring you today's coronavirus press briefing from Downing Street, being led today by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. First, though, a look at today's developments, because there's been a U-turn from the government after it abandoned the coronavirus tracing app, which was being piloted on the Isle of Wight. Instead, it's switching to a model based on technology provided by Google and Apple. The Apple-Google design has been promoted as being more privacy-focused, but it does also mean that epidemiologists will have access to less data. Meanwhile, it's been revealed in new figures today that 1 in 4 people who test positive for coronavirus haven't been reached by contact tracers in England. In Northern Ireland, ministers have agreed that social distancing of 1 metre is safe and appropriate for children and young people at school. August the 24th is the expected date for schools to reopen there. In Scotland, the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that the country has moved to the second phase of its 4-phase route map aimed at ending the lockdown. Those shielding will be allowed to meet up with friends or family outdoors, and most shops will reopen on June the 29th. Across the UK, a further 135 people with coronavirus have died, taking the total to 42,288. More on all of that coming up, but first, Richard Galpin on that test and trace U-turn in England.
Testing those with symptoms of coronavirus, and if they're positive, tracing all the people they've been in close contact with recently, is regarded as one of the key ways of slowing the spread of the virus. According to the latest figures for England for the past week, almost 6,000 people who tested positive had their details passed on to the test and trace system. But around a quarter of them could not be reached. Of those who were reached, almost 45,000 were asked to self-isolate, an increase of around 12,000 from the previous week.
If you test positive, NHS Test and Trace will contact you to trace people you might have infected.
The fact that a quarter of people with the virus are not being traced will add to the concerns that the government's programme is not working well.
The test and trace system that has been set up through the government procedures is really falling short of capability. It is falling far short of where it needs to be to allow the lockdown to proceed, the undoing of the lockdown to proceed.
Meanwhile, on the Isle of Wight, more problems for the test and trace system. The app, which was trialled here for many weeks and should have been launched already, is facing further delays into the winter. This apparently due to more technical problems. And this afternoon, a U-turn by the government on the app. It's now switching to a model based on technology provided by Google and Apple. In Japan today, in sharp contrast with all this, a government minister announced the launching of their test and trace app. It will, the minister said, quickly warn those who are using the app if they've been in close contact with someone infected by the virus. And he said this would save lives. Back here in the UK, the infection rate continues to fall. But ensuring there aren't further outbreaks depends on the contact tracing system working well. It was, after all, supposed to be up and running before the government started lifting the lockdown. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, our health correspondent Catherine Burns is here with me. Catherine, clearly big problems with this app. Do you think we're ever going to have one?
Well, that is the million-dollar question here. So it could possibly not happen. So initially, right from the beginning, it's been, we're going to have a world-beating system and this app is going to be a vital part of it. Slowly over time, that's trickled down to this is going to be the cherry on top of the cake, and the cake is what's important. But now the talk seems to be more about a possible companion app. So this wouldn't be necessarily contact tracing. This is an app that you could order a test on, and then if you had to go into isolation, it would give you guidance and information. And really, this all comes down to the technology. The technology is really new. If you think what a contact tracing app needs to do, two things essentially. It needs to see who you're with, how close you are to them. And now we've got these two different platforms. The NHS app apparently is not that great at finding out who you're actually with, especially if you're using an Apple phone. So if you're using an Apple phone, they say it only picks up about 4% of the contacts, because the way that Apple works, it kind of pushes this technology right to the background. On the other hand, the Google Apple thing is very good at this, but not so good, it seems, at picking up how close you are to someone. And obviously this is absolutely key, because there's no point telling someone you've got to self-isolate now for 2 weeks because you've been in contact with someone, when if they haven't necessarily been within 2 to 3 metres. There are no promises being made right now. All we're hearing is that the technology is not there yet. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't.
Really interesting. Many thanks. Kath Burns there, our health correspondent. Well, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, is in Westminster for us now. Vicky, the words U-turn are being splashed everywhere. Must be embarrassing for the government, particularly given that this is the latest U-turn in several weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting they're saying no promises are being made. It will be interesting to hear from Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, later on what he predicts will happen with this app, because part of the problem has been the government really over-promising, and Boris Johnson just a month ago saying that this was going to be a world-beating system and that it would be in place by the 1st of June. Now, I think people listening to that at the time did wonder whether the UK was suddenly going to be able to be beating a system that's been in, for example, South Korea for a very long time. And of course, that just makes it worse when the reality doesn't happen. So that's been a huge problem. Lots of people were saying at the time, and then watching what happened in Germany, that they did switch to this other system. And the fact that the UK thought it could do something that others weren't doing maybe wasn't, with hindsight, the best thing to do. Now, of course, some Conservative MPs would say, look, it's good to aim high. It's good to try and get the best system in place, and you just have to accept it when things go wrong. But as you say, other U-turns, if you look at the promise, of course, to get all primary school children back by the end of term, something the government then had to go back on. And I think this is becoming a bit of a theme, and that will be worrying for lots of MPs and lots of people watching. They want to be able to trust the government that when it says something is going to happen, that they can follow it through and deliver on it.
OK, Vicky, we'll be talking to you again just before the Downing Street press conference starts. But for the moment, thank you very much. Vicky Young there. Well, as we mentioned, more than 1 in 4 people who've tested positive for coronavirus cannot be reached by the test and trace system in England. The latest figures show that the details of just over 14,000 people with positive tests were passed on to the NHS track and trace service during its first 2 weeks. Of those, contact tracers successfully reached 10,192 people and asked them to provide details of people that they'd mixed with. But the track and trace service in England was unable to contact 3,853 people. So that's just over a quarter of the people with positive tests. Well, I'm joined now by Professor Sir Chris Ham, who's a health policy academic, and he's the non-executive chair of the Coventry and Warwickshire Health and Care Partnership. And he's also the non-executive director of Royal Free Hospitals. Hello there, Professor Ham. Thanks so much for joining us here on BBC News. So what do you make of these figures? They sound initially worrying.
Well, on the face of it, there's some progress compared with the update we had last week. But can I put this in context? the test and trace service has picked up a minority of the new COVID-19 cases, around about 10,000 over the last 2 weeks. If you look at the ONS community surveillance research, there probably have been between 50 and 70,000 new cases in that period. So generously, test and trace is picking up only 20% of people newly diagnosed with COVID-19. That's more important in some ways than the other data in today's report. Also important is the national aspect of test and trace. People who are working on telephones out of call centres or from home, they've reached, as you've said, around about 10,000 contacts of those who've been tested positive. But there are another 77,000 people who've been contacted by Public Health England or by local public health teams who've been brought into this process late in the day. And why does that matter? Well, 25,000 contact tracers are working on this national telephone-based scheme, and yet in the last 2 weeks, they've only been in touch with 10,000 contacts. I would have thought that suggests that we've hired too many and we put too much emphasis on this national element and not enough on the critical local contribution through our councils and the public health teams.
Well, that's really interesting. I wonder why you think the centralised system is not picking up more people. Is it because there are people who've got the virus but are not displaying symptoms?
Well, that's part of it, certainly. But if you look at the experience in other countries, your report mentions South Korea, but Germany and New Zealand would be further examples. They haven't relied on a national system with people working from call centres or working on telephones from home to do the contact tracing. They've relied on regional or local public health teams, people who've been trained to do this work, who are in touch with their local communities and who are much better placed because of that local knowledge to follow up with the contact tracing and to support people where it's appropriate, to isolate at home, and then to provide the wherewithal to enable them to do that successfully. So this is yet another example, I'm afraid to say, of English exceptionalism, the government trying to do it differently based on their own understanding of what the priorities should be, rather than learning from best practice internationally, and rather than, and this is the critical point, using the local experience which our councils and public health directors can bring. That is now happening on a small scale. It's ramping up, but it's not yet at a point where we can be confident we have the capability we need to safeguard the population as the lockdown is being eased.
So do you think the government should be directing more of its energies to this more localised, decentralised system?
Yes, I do. That is the fundamental flaw in the design of the system. Tom Reardon, who's the chief exec of Leeds City Council, was hired by the government about 5 or 6 weeks ago to come in, work with Baroness Harding and her team to do precisely that. And he is making some progress. He gave evidence to a parliamentary select committee earlier this week setting out that progress. But he's got a tough job to do because the government spent 2 months or so before Baroness Harding and Tom Reardon and others were brought in, trying to develop this national system, outsourcing the contact tracing to the private sector and believing that was the best way of going forward, when all the international evidence suggests a regional, local approach is much more preferable. So things have moved in a more positive direction, but far too late in the day. And I'm afraid it's another example of the missteps and the mistakes the government has made in its handling of this crisis.
One other brief question. Do you think that the current system is strong enough for lockdown measures to be eased further in the next review?
Not yet. We need to allow our councils, their public health teams, more time. They've been asked to produce local outbreak plans by the end of June in anticipation there will be local flare-ups and outbreaks in different communities rather than a national second wave. They're still doing that. They're still identifying the people locally, environmental health, trading standards, sexual health service staff, who are skilled in doing contact tracing, who need to be in place. And critically, to make sure we all understand what they will be doing alongside the Public Health England regional teams, who are quite expert in some of this, and the 25,000 people working from telephones nationally. There's a lot of scope for this to go wrong unless it's executed in a very professional and competent way. And so far, the government's track record in doing that is not good.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Sir Chris Ham, thank you so much. Thank you. Now, Scotland is moving to the next phase of its plan to ease the lockdown. Nicola Sturgeon has been outlining the details in the last hour. Our correspondent Lorna Gordon is in Glasgow for us now. Lorna.
Yes, Rita, the First Minister said that care and caution still needed to be exercised, but that because of people's actions over the last 3 months, some further restrictions can now be lifted. But those restrictions, which were set out in phase 2 of the Scottish route map, will be lifted in a staggered way, she said. Some highlights for you, because there is an awful lot to unpack, but some highlights for you are that from today, those who are shielding can now exercise from outside, and from tomorrow they can meet outdoors with people from one other household, but in groups of no more than 8. There'll also be a further easing on the restrictions on the economy, more construction from Monday, face masks also mandatory on public transport on that day, then a week on Monday, so in 11 days' time, factories and warehouses can reopen here in Scotland, but with strict physical distancing measures in place, and shops of all sizes with outdoor entrances can reopen, but no shopping malls. One element that wasn't set out today but was originally in the phase 2 easing is outdoor hospitality, beer gardens for instance. There's no green light for that yet. The First Minister saying more scientific advice is being sought to guide that decision. So it is all getting quite complicated here in Scotland, and that means that there's going to be a change in the government's message too.
So in this next phase, instead of asking you to stay home, protect the NHS and save lives, we will be asking you to stay safe, protect others and save lives. This advice recognises that although the virus is being suppressed, it has not gone away. It is still highly infectious, it is still deadly to some, and it is dangerous to many.
Well, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Jackson Carlaw, said that Ms Sturgeon doesn't understand the depth of the economic and education crisis caused by the extended lockdown. But Nicola Sturgeon's argument is that patients, she said, will reap the biggest rewards. She said the prize for going more slowly is that any recovery will be more sustainable in the long run.
OK, Lorna, many thanks. Our correspondent Lorna Gordon there in Glasgow. Tributes have been pouring in to Dame Vera Lynn, the wartime singer who's died at the age of 103. Known as the Force's sweetheart, Dame Vera's music came to symbolise Britain's spirit during the Second World War, conveying hope during the bleakest days of the conflict. Songs including We'll Meet Again and The White Cliffs of Dover united soldiers with their families on the home front. The Prime Minister said her voice lifted the country in its darkest hours and will live on for generations to come. Robert Hall looks back at her life.
There'll be bluebirds over.
It is a voice that has spanned the decades. The voice of an ordinary London girl born at the end of the First World War who became an iconic symbol of the Second. Vera Welch, daughter of a plumber and a dressmaker, began singing as a child. She took her grandmother's surname, Lynn, as a stage name, made her first record aged 19 and sold 1 million records in the next 3 years.
This little girl from East Ham would never have had the opportunity if she hadn't have been singing, if my mother hadn't put me on the stage.
This letter of mine is getting to be a sort of rendezvous where husbands and wives, torn apart by war, can be brought together by music.
When war broke out again, Vera began broadcasting with the BBC. Through a Forces Request programme, Sincerely Yours, she became the girl that thousands of fighting men hoped they'd meet when they returned home, although some accused the programme of damaging the war effort.
Too sentimental, making the boys homesick. And I said, that's rubbish, a lot of rubbish, I said, because the letters are so thankful for the programmes.
Vera was a star, but her desire to do more took her to meet fans halfway around the world.
So they said, well, where do you want to go? I said, well, if I'm going in, I know Europe are getting well supplied. I want to go somewhere where there isn't any entertainment. So they said, well, Burma's the only place, you know.
She kept a record of her jungle adventures in a secret diary.
I took my little diary, my little pencil, and just about see it, tiny little writing. Slept on stretcher, oh yes, balanced on 2 kitchen chairs. A rotten night, I should think so.
It's not being awarded you earned it. You earned it more.
It was another 40 years before Vera Lynn received her own Burma star. By then, she was Dame Vera Lynn and as busy as ever.
Am I allowed to kiss you?
In 1995, Vera led veterans in song outside Buckingham Palace to mark the 50th anniversary of VE Day. And in 2010, aged 94, she topped the charts once again.
It was a shock. I thought, oh, 70 years ago, the same song was #1. And little did I think that I would even still be around, let alone have a #1 hit.
On Dame Vera's 100th birthday, she listened to the children of her old school and remembered the singing coach she ignored.
When she heard me sing, she says, no, I can't train that voice. It's not a natural voice. So I said, well, thank you very much, madam, and left.
Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies chase those dark clouds far away.
But Vera Lynn's national presence was more than a voice. It was a spirit, carried forward across the decades and still resonating during the current pandemic. A spirit reflected by the Queen during her recent, very personal message.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
We meet again. Don't know where, don't know when.
Vera Lynn's strongest bonds were always with the veterans she still referred to as my boys. The words she sang will endure long after the last of them has left us.
Some sunny day.
Dame Vera Lynn, who's died at the age of 103. Well, we can speak now to the singer, actress and entertainer Anita Harris, who featured in the Royal Variety Show lineup alongside Dame Vera Lynn in 1990 and performed at her 100th birthday celebration show at the London Palladium in 2017. Hello, Anita. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to ask you about what it was like to perform with her then, but I just wanted to ask, first of all, I don't know if you could hear that piece that came broadcast there. I mean, her enduring appeal and importance in British life was so evident.
Hello, Rita. Just hearing that, it's a sad day, but you can't listen to that and not smile. I mean, she gifted the world and she gifted Great Britain with so much. And I've said in my message that she absolutely, when she sent those messages home from the troops to their families, they were golden nuggets. And I think that's what she was a golden light in a very dark time. So to use the word gift is exactly what she gave to us all. And those wonderful clips that you've just played, I mean, that is her lifetime of work. And how wonderful. It's her light is shining everywhere today, bless her. Lovely lady.
Yes, it spanned so many decades, didn't it? And I'm just very struck. You performed with her in 1990, and then you performed at her 100th birthday celebrations in 2017, and that's 27 years apart. But tell us, what was she like?
A proper lady in the true British sense. She was so natural in her manner that everything else that surrounded her. I met her, first of all, with Harry Seacombe for the Royal Varieties, because I'd been on tour with the CSE, Combined Services with Harry, and the Army Benevolent Fund. I'd done a lot of tours. I followed much later, but in her footsteps, so to Borneo and Kuching and to Germany. And, you know, when you meet the forces and you meet what treasures they are, you also can see in their eyes, when Dame Vera Lynn is mentioned, their eyes light up. They're so grateful. And I think that's really what everybody is thinking today. And to work with her and to be on that stage, especially the Palladium stage, it was an absolute joy. She treated everybody the same. She knew her position was center stage, but with that, she gifted us to be in her little world that was focused in that spotlight. And of course, when the Queen turned up, and it was just a magical, magical evening. And I'm so proud and very privileged to feel that I was sharing that bit of stage with her. Yeah.
Did you get a sense of how she viewed her central place in British history and culture? The Forces sweetheart, that's a big role to carry.
A huge role to carry, but she was of a time, and the most important time for this country. And so I met her dear husband, Harry, and of course, Ginny, Virginia, her daughter. And she was very grounded, very down to earth. She loved her home and the people. She loved to be just herself. But if you're in that position, and every time a song like We'll Meet Again comes up and is broadcast, you can't, for her to be in that bubble, it must give you a wonderful feeling that you're reaching out to the general public, to people that you meet in the street. And I think that she was blessed with both sides, a bit of show business, but also to be part of the British public, which she was. Yeah. Lovely, lovely lady.
It's so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much, Anita Harris, for sharing those memories of Dame Vera Lynn. Thank you very much.
I'm honoured. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And if you want to get more on the life and times and influence of Dame Vera Lynn, as you can see, there is a special programme, a tribute to Dame Vera Lynn, being broadcast on BBC One tonight at 7:30, and viewers in Wales can see that at the same time on BBC Two. Now, the French President Emmanuel Macron is visiting London to mark the 80th anniversary of General de Gaulle's famous call for wartime resistance. The radio address, delivered from here at Broadcasting House, urged people in France not to give up the fight against Hitler. President Macron is currently meeting the Prime Minister, and this is the scene live of the two men who are outside and waiting for a joint fly-past that, I was going to say, we hope to be able to bring you, but here they come. It is the British Red Arrows and their French counterparts, the Patrouille de France. There we go. Celebrating and remembering, of course, the anniversary of that call to resistance by General de Gaulle. Yeah, flying side by side at the moment. Absolutely spectacular formation. Hard to tell from here who is ahead. I think it may be the Red Arrows that are leading it. And marvellously a blue sky, so we can see so well. It's been very wet in London during the day, but it's all cleared up now. So the red planes that we can see closest to us are the Red Arrows, not surprisingly.
We got stuff in the street.
Right, I think that may be it. That fly past was due to pass over Buckingham Palace at 5 o'clock precisely, and we are a minute past 5. They flew in from Oxfordshire, which is where I think that they will eventually return. Right, well, from an RAF, from a Red Arrows and Patrouille de France fly past to Vicky Young, our chief political correspondent. That's a good introduction, Vicky. What do we expect this afternoon? What sort of questions are we going to get from Matt Hancock?
I think there will inevitably be a lot of questions about this Test and Trace app, the one that they have now decided the government to switch to, a different one, and really no promises on when it will be ready. Even though Boris Johnson talked about a world-beating system being ready by the 1st of June, there have clearly been some huge problems with it, and all the focus instead is going to be on the human contact tracers. And every week we've been getting figures about how many people have been contacted, how many contacts they have given, how many have been traced. So an update on all of that, because Matt Hancock will be alongside Dido Harding, who has been in charge of all of that. So the government says, yes, the app would be nice, and that at one point was going to be a central part of all of this. That clearly hasn't worked out. So now they are relying on, a tried and tested technique, if you like. It's something that Public Health England have used for a very long time. But of course, it does involve contacting people directly. They have to hand over the contacts that they have had. And then the idea is everyone is told that they must quarantine, they must go into self-isolation. And the government would say, well, that means that there are thousands of people not wandering around inadvertently, passing the virus around. And so they hope that that will be enough to make sure there is no second wave of infections.
Vicky, while you were speaking, viewers, in fact, here we are again, viewers are watching President Macron, I think probably in the process of saying goodbye to Boris Johnson after their talks earlier in the day, and they both came out to watch that fly past that happened. We were speaking a little earlier, you and I, and you mentioned how the government in a way has made life difficult for itself by promising a world-beating app, and those were Boris Johnson's own words, I think, weren't they? And you rather feel that they may have come back to haunt him.
Yeah, and I think even when he said that was only a month ago, lots of people watching were thinking, well, that is quite a big claim, given there are many countries, including South Korea and others, who are much more used to dealing with coronaviruses. They have these systems up and running and have done for a while. And to say that ours would be world-beating, inevitably, I think led to some raised eyebrows. And then, of course, the fact that now that pilot that's been going on the Isle of Wight, I was talking to some people a couple of weeks ago who felt they were ready to go to the next stage of that, but that has all now moved away, and they've decided they do have to move to this different system, which is not as centralised. And it's problems that other countries have had, and they switched a while ago to a different system. So I think many people thought it was a bit inevitable. But talking to people in Downing Street over the last couple of weeks, they were definitely moving away from it, saying, look, the app would be good and it'd be nice to have, and if it's working, that's a great thing. It's the cherry on the cake. but knowing, I think, that they were going to have to rely on this much more manual, if you like, system that has been working. And today there are more figures showing that more than 70% of those who tested positive for coronavirus were contacted. They then hand over their contacts and they have to all be traced and told they have been within 2 meters of somebody who has tested positive. And that's the idea behind the system. You're told that's happened and you are then expected to do the right thing and to go into isolation. Of course, that's what they're banking on, as they are with lots of this, is that people decide they do the right thing to protect others.
Vicky, we are waiting for the Downing Street briefing to start. We were looking at pictures there as you were speaking, taken a little earlier in Downing Street, of Boris Johnson and President Macron posing for the cameras, chatting. Quite a lot for them to discuss, isn't there? There's quarantine and there's also Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, the word Brexit that we haven't talked about much, but of course is slowly coming back on the agenda. The British government making very clear they're not going to ask.
Vicky, I'm going to stop you.
Here's Matt Hancock. Briefing. I'm joined today by Baroness Dido Harding, the Executive Chair of NHS Test and Trace. Before we start, I want to recognise the sad loss of Dame Vera Lynn. She united us in the worst crisis that this country faced, and ever since she's inspired us all with the words that she will always be associated with: "We will meet again." And we send our condolences to her family, and we will all remember her warmly. The first thing I want to do is take you through the latest data and then talk about progress with NHS Test and Trace and vaccines. If we go to the first slide, please. The first slide shows that yesterday there were 136,516 tests, taking the total to over 7.25 million tests in total, and that there were 1,218 positive test results. If we go to the next slide. This slide shows the estimated average number of people who had COVID-19 in England. This is according to the ONS survey. And as you can see, the number has been coming down over time. And this same survey implies around 4,500 new cases per day. Next slide, please. Data from hospitals also shows that broad downward direction. There are 490 admissions with COVID-19 on the 15th of June. And as we can see, the number of people on mechanical ventilator beds is now 360. Next slide, please. The number of people in hospital continues to come down in almost every region. You can see a very small uptick in the east of England, but as you can see from the charts, there's some movement in the variation in each of the lines, and the overall movement continues to be down, and overall down to 5,193 from 5,863 this time last week. And the final slide of this group, please. When it comes to the number of people who've sadly died with coronavirus, yesterday the number of deaths reported was 135, bringing the total to 42,288. And again, we can see the downward trajectory, thankfully, of that number. And the number 135 is lower than this time last week, but there is still some way to go. There's one additional report that's worth looking at, which is that Public Health England today published their weekly surveillance report, which shows that last week, for the first week since mid-March, the number of people who died in this country in total from coronavirus and anything else was no higher than is normal at this time of year. So that demonstrates that the number of deaths is coming right down. But the battle against this virus is not over. And it's a battle on many fronts. And there's two areas I want to update you on today. The first is vaccines. And before I talk about corona vaccines, I just want to mention a very important reminder about other routine vaccines that are there to protect you. Throughout the crisis, we've tried to keep the vaccination programmes for children going, and that has been largely successful. But if you or your child is invited for a vaccination, like MMR, then please make sure you attend. It's very important that we don't fall behind on the vaccinations for other diseases because of this crisis. During the pandemic, we've put the stringent measures in place to protect people who are getting vaccinations. And in the long run, the best way to defeat this virus is, of course, the discovery of a vaccine. And since the start, we've been supporting the most promising projects. As of this week, the Imperial vaccine is now in the first phase of human clinical trials, and AstraZeneca has struck a deal for the manufacture of the Oxford vaccine. They're starting manufacturing now, even ahead of approval, so we can build up a stockpile and be ready should it be clinically approved. Just like with dexamethasone, the treatment, which we stockpiled before we had proof that it was clinically effective. So we are starting the manufacture of the Oxford vaccine now so that it'll be ready should the science come off. Today we have also published the way in which we propose to prioritise people for access to a vaccine as soon as one comes available. Just as we did for testing, we'll be guided by the clinical science, prioritising those in most need. I'm very grateful to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which has published its interim advice today. They recommend priority vaccination for two groups: frontline health and social care workers and those at increased risk of serious disease and death from coronavirus, including, for example, adults over the age of 50 and those with heart and kidney disease. As we learn more about the virus, we'll continue to take into account which groups may be particularly vulnerable, including, for example, those from ethnic minority backgrounds, so we can protect the most at risk first should a vaccine become available and get this country back on our feet as soon as we possibly can. Our approach to vaccines is to throw everything at it as fast as we can and rigorously to test and make sure that they're safe before deployment. This is our approach across the board, in fact, including on Test and Trace too, and that's the second area that I want to focus on today. Baroness Harding will talk you through the latest figures from our NHS Test and Trace programme shortly. Today's data show a system that is working well and constantly improving. And remember that each one of the thousands of people who are now isolating because of the NHS Test and Trace programme and all the work of those involved is someone who would have been innocently going about their daily lives not knowing that they were a risk to their community. And as you may remember, our plan is to complement this human contact tracing with a contact tracing app. Like other governments around the world, we've been working hard on this, and I want to be upfront and open about the challenges that we and other countries are facing. Over the past few weeks, we have rigorously tested our prototype app in the Isle of Wight and in field trials, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved and all the islanders of the Isle of Wight, the council, who've been brilliant, the local NHS, and Bob Seeley, the MP, who has played a real leadership role. Thank you. Because of this testing, we discovered a technical barrier that every other country building their own app is also now hitting. We found that our app works well on Android devices, but Apple's software prevents iPhones being used effectively for contact tracing unless you're using Apple's own technology. After we started our work on our app, Google and Apple then started working on their own product. And as soon as they did this, we began working on both. We kept our options open in the same way that we do with other areas. And I personally feel in this fight, more than any other, that we must leave no stone unturned. So I asked Dido and the NHS X team to make sure that they worked on both products. Of course, we've been testing Google and Apple's product too. And as we did this, we found that it does not estimate distance well enough. Measuring distance, of course, is mission critical to any contact tracing app. So as it stands, our app won't work because Apple won't change their system, but it can measure distance, and their app can't measure distance well enough to a standard that we are satisfied with. Throughout this, for me, what matters is what works, because what works will save lives. And I will work with anyone, public or private sector, here or overseas, to gain any inch of ground against this disease. So we've agreed to join forces with Google and Apple to bring the best bits of both systems together. We'll share our algorithm and the work that we've done on distance calculation and combine that with their work to deliver a new solution. I've always been optimistic about the contribution that technology can make in this battle against coronavirus. And coming together in this way will bring together some of the best minds to find a solution to this global challenge and help to save lives. In the meantime, the NHS test and trace system, based on good old-fashioned human contact tracing, is working well, identifying local outbreaks and helping to control this virus. And I want to ask you all once more, if you get a call or a message from NHS Test and Trace, the most important thing is please do your bit to protect your community, to protect your loved ones, and to protect the NHS, and follow those instructions. I'd now like to hand over to Baroness Harding to take us through the test and tracing stats.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Could I have the slide, please? As the figures show, in the second week of the programme, 5,949 people who had tested positive for coronavirus had their details transferred to the contact tracing system. Of those people, 4,366, that's 73% of the total, were reached and asked to provide details of their recent close contacts. That's a small increase from 72% in the first week of operation. And similar to what we saw last week, it's very encouraging that 78% gave us this information within 24 hours of being asked to do so. We really appreciate and recognise everyone's swift response. Using that information, as you can see on the next slide, we were able to identify 44,895 people who had been in close contact with someone who tested positive. Of those, 40,690 people were advised to self-isolate, which is 91% of all the contacts identified. This is very similar to what we saw in the first week of operation, and again, this was done within good time. These statistics are encouraging. They demonstrate that we're making progress against a good starting point we outlined last week. Last time I spoke to you, I made a commitment that NHS Test and Trace would keep learning, improving and refining to become a high-quality service that all of us can depend on. In partnership with Public Health England and local government, we are right now protecting local communities from outbreaks. I'd also like to outline some of the steps we've taken that set us on that journey of continuous improvement. Firstly, we've changed the process of requesting tests. We've taken out the need to copy a 16-digit code between websites when a test is booked to make it easier for us, for all of us. Secondly, we're changing how our labs operate. We're changing shift patterns so that some labs are working overnight and some are working weekends to match when samples arrive for testing. And thirdly, we've connected people's test results to their GP records. And these improvements will continue. We will continue to work towards an app which forms part of the end-to-end service of NHS Test and Trace and enables people to engage with every aspect of the service. And I'd like to reiterate everything that the Secretary of State has just said in thanking the people who have been involved in developing and trialling the app to date, and in particular, the people of the Isle of Wight. We are truly grateful for your support. Finally, I'd like to take a step back from some of our operational changes and show you what NHS Test and Trace should mean to you if you ever need to use it. And I can't do this any better than by reading the words of one of our brilliant clinical contact tracers who shared their experience of contacting a lady who had tested positive for coronavirus and was nervous about what it meant for her and her family. In their words, She needed to hear a professional, calm and caring voice who was there to listen, advise and support. She needed to be reassured and hear that she was doing a great job caring for her daughter. And after we had finished, she told me that I'd made her burden feel lighter and that she wished we could speak every day. I've said before that NHS Test and Trace is a service for the public that works best as a partnership with the public. And to me, the work of our contact tracers shows us what a true partnership looks like. I want people to know that NHS Test and Trace will be there for them when they need it. And I want to reiterate what I said last week. If you have symptoms, a fever, a new continuous cough, or a loss or change in your sense of smell or taste, then testing is available. You can and must book yourself a test. If one of your children has a fever, stay at home and order a test. If NHS Test and Trace gets in touch with you to say you've tested positive, you should go online or call us on 119 if you don't have the internet and provide us with accurate, up-to-date information about your recent close contacts. And if you're one of those contacts, it's vitally important that you do what tens of thousands of others are already doing and self-isolate. Because in doing so, you will be taking the virus out of circulation. You'll be protecting your friends, your family, and the wider community from infection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Harding. We'll now go to questions from the public and then to questions from the media thereafter. So the first question is from Luke in Cardiff by video.
Hello, good evening. Every year, thousands of students from different areas of the country come together in one place to start the university year. How is the government supporting universities and local councils to ensure that the influx of students in one town or city doesn't result in a local outbreak of the virus? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luke. That is a great question. And of course, the work is ongoing now, led by the Department for Education, to make sure that we can do as much as we can to ensure a safe restart of universities in the same way that we're working towards the safe restart of schools in the autumn. And that's incredibly important work, both in terms of what happens inside the institution, but also, exactly as you say, when people go to university, they usually travel. And places like Cardiff, which of course has a brilliant university, in fact two, there are many students who go there. It's a really important point. It's something that the DFE is working very hard on. Thanks very much for your question, Luke. The next question is from Stuart in Birmingham. And Stuart asks, as a large number of people have been working from home during the lockdown period, is the government planning to pass laws that will make it easier for employees who wish to continue working from home to do so as lockdown is eased? Well, the number one thing I'd say, Stuart, is that working from home is absolutely recommended wherever it's possible. Of course, there are some industries in which it's just not possible, some jobs. But wherever it's possible, we recommend working from home. I think one of the big things that people have learned from this crisis is the opportunity of working from home and how it can be effective. And thank goodness the technology is now readily available to make that so. So it's certainly something that I think will stay with us a long time after the crisis. Those Zoom calls or other technologies are available. I'm very happy to talk to the business department to ask whether there's laws that need to change given that big change in how people are using technology. I think we should take that away and look at it. But the best thing is, in the first instance, of course, people can work from home. Where people can work from home, they should do so, and businesses, employers should facilitate that. Thanks very much, Stuart. Great question. The next question is from Hugh Pym of the BBC. Hugh.
Thank you very much. You had said that the smartphone app would play a central role in testing and tracing. It's now been delayed. When do you think the app will be involved in identifying and tracing contacts?
Well, thanks, Hugh. We are working on it, is the answer. We're not going to put a date on it, I'm afraid, because I'm absolutely determined that whilst this technology can help, it's got to be working effectively. And the central point of test and trace is actually the fact that when you are identified as at risk, you then isolate, and asking people to isolate for 2 weeks is a big thing. And so I would not recommend an app unless I'm confident in it. I've explained, I hope, why the best parts of the 2 systems that we've been working on can be brought together. But I am confident that we will get there. We will put that cherry on Dido's cake.
A quick follow-up on another subject, if I may.
Sure.
More than 2 million people are shielding, and there have been reports in the last day or two about the scheme coming to an end at the end of July, based, it seems, on briefings to charities. Can you end the uncertainty and give people in that situation a proper indication of what is going to happen?
Well, Hugh, I know how sensitive this is to the 2.2 million people who are shielding and their families, and we've asked them to do something which is really, really big over the last 3 months, which is to stay at home almost entirely. Until recently, we put forward the clinical advice that it's okay to go out very carefully to exercise. We will be bringing forward the next steps very, very soon. But I don't want to go into any more detail because I want that to be done properly, and I want it to be done with the support of the charities who do so much to support those 2.2 million people. And so there will be a formal government publication, and we will write to every single member of that group to make sure that they know what it means for them. In the meantime, the advice remains to keep shielding, and the current programme and the end date of the programme is, of course, the end of this month. But before then, everybody will get an individualised letter from the NHS to explain what they need to do next. Thanks very much, Hugh. The next question is from Tom Clark of ITV. Tom.
Hello, Secretary of State. Thank you. First, a question for Baroness Harding, if I may, about test and trace. We just heard there from the Secretary of State about 4,500 people a week are estimated to be a day are estimated to be getting coronavirus in the community. A rough calculation suggests about 10,000 symptomatic people a week could be out there in the population. Yet you're testing just a fraction of that are actually getting through to test and trace. If you're missing so many people who are symptomatic for COVID and getting tested, how can we be sure that test and trace can stay on top of outbreaks?
Dido.
So, thank you, Tom. There are 2 things that we need to do, and one of those things is for all of us. So, we are missing some people who have symptoms who are not getting tested. And so all of us have got to learn this new behaviour, that if we have a temperature, if we have a continuous cough, or we lose our sense of taste or smell, the first thing we should do is stay at home, and the second thing is we should order a test. So that's why you've heard me say this from this podium this weekend, last week. There's something for all of us to do. If one of our children, and young children get temperatures all the time, and it's a new behaviour. If one of your children has a fever overnight, you stay at home with the family, look after them and order a test. The second thing we have to do is get better at hunting out the virus. 70% or so of people who have the virus won't show any symptoms or will have such mild symptoms they might not spot it. And that's why we're doing targeted testing for people in high contact professions, such as health and social care, but also other roles. We're looking to expand that. So there's more work for NHS Test and Trace to do. So perversely, I'm one of the very few people working in government that wants to see the number of people testing positive go up each day, because it means that we will have a more targeted and efficient testing system. But obviously, we also want fewer people to get the virus. So I'm not pretending that it is perfect. Of course it isn't. We all have work to do to keep honing it and improving it.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks very much. Can I just follow up with one more for you Secretary of State? The system isn't perfect. We've just heard that from Baroness Harding. We have those continuing to ease lockdown measures. Could that explain why we are seeing, in that PhD data that you mentioned earlier, an increase in outbreaks in schools, in hospitals, in other settings compared to during the lockdown period? How do you explain that?
Well, the good thing is that we're seeing a reduction in the number of people dying from coronavirus, and indeed a reduction in the number of people dying overall, so that there are now actually just slightly fewer people dying in the last week's data than in a normal June week in a normal year. It's statistically equivalent, those two data points. We are doing much more to be able to trace these individual outbreaks. For instance, there's an outbreak right now in parts of Leicester that we're working very hard to track down, and we're putting in a mobile testing unit, and we're working hard on that. There's another in Kirklees in Yorkshire. Again, we've sent in mobile testing units. We're working with, in both cases, the local council, and in both cases, the local director of public health is doing a magnificent job working with the NHS Test and Trace scheme and the Joint Biosecurity Centre as our sort of our eyes and ears. So there are these local outbreaks. We've seen them all the way through, and we now have the system in place to be able to spot them as best we can and then take that local action. And it's natural that as you lift as the lockdown lifts slightly, we've always said the next move is to more localized action in order to tackle outbreaks where we find them. Dido, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I would just say that we have a very large-scale test and tracing service up and running now. If you look at the scale of our national service in terms of tests conducted per 100,000 of population, in terms of contact tracers per 100,000 population, it stands comparison with anyone in the world. So we have a service that is fit for purpose for as we stand now, and it will get better and better with each passing week.
Thanks, Tom. The next question is from Andy Bell from Channel 5 News. Andy.
Thank you very much. A question for both of you. The app has been described as the cherry on the cake, as there seem to be more and more problems developing with it. It's much more than that, isn't it, if we're ever going to go back to normal? Because it's all very well for people to have contact tracing. They can remember the people that they knew, that they were in touch with it. But if we're going to get back to normal and people are standing in bus queues or getting on trains, they're not going to know who those people are. So an app is absolutely vital, isn't it, to get back to any kind of normality?
Well, the thing that's vital to get back to the sort of normality you describe is to get the number of infections right down, and to have the treatments and the vaccine available, and to have a world-class test and trace system as a whole. And actually, one of the things that we've learned from the Isle of Wight is the importance of the human in the contact tracing, and that the app is an important addition, exactly as you described. For instance, somebody sitting on the bus that you wouldn't know and therefore be able to pass the contacts on. But the core is the human contact tracing element of it, and so that's But we still want the app to work. That's why we backed both horses. And we'll keep working with all the technologists to get one that does. Dido.
I'd just add that this is a global challenge, that what we've done in really rigorously testing both our own COVID-19 app and the Google Apple version is demonstrate that none of them are working sufficiently well enough to actually be reliable to determine whether any of us should self-isolate for 2 weeks. That's true across the world. And yet, a number of countries, including ourselves, have got scale and effective test and trace services. I think clearly having an app that can help identify people you don't know would be a hugely helpful addition to those of us that commute. But there are other things we can all do. Good hand hygiene, being really aware of social distancing, wearing a face mask on public transport, all of those things are well within our abilities now. And I do think what we are building is fundamentally a human, local community service that will be digitally assisted. That technology on its own isn't going to solve this. It's all of us in the way that we behave that will.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, of course.
But if you don't have a date and you can't give us a date for when this app will be ready, and there's been discussion even today of it being autumn/winter before an app is up and running in the way that it needs to be, that basically means, can we get back to normal life in terms of people getting on commuter trains, etc., before autumn/winter? That's an awful long way away.
Well, I'd simply say, Andy, that the core of the NHS Test and Trace programme is to ask people who are higher risk to isolate. And as you've seen in the statistics that Dido's just shown, that now covers 87,000 people. And so there's a very significant operation in place. Of course, it can be enhanced. Both the human side will continue to improve, as we've always said, and adding the technology. But I absolutely don't put the direct link that you do between the two. But we'll get the app up and running as soon as we can. But I will not recommend people to download the app until I'm confident that that's the right thing to do, because I'd be asking people to download the app and then to self-isolate if it tells you to, and that is a big thing to ask of people. And so you'll understand why, rather than just putting this out, even though there are these problems with it, I'd far rather not. I'd far rather get it right. Thanks very much, Andy. Next question is from Heather Stewart of The Guardian. Heather, how are you?
I'm very well. So there have been reports of problems with the app for weeks now with the NHS version. Australia announced on the 6th of May that it was switching to a Google Apple approach because it realised that it wasn't working, developing a bespoke app. Has it taken us too long to realise that this is not something that we can do ourselves? And is that because we were too fixated on being world-beating?
No, actually, quite the contrary, Heather. I'm from Newmarket. We backed both horses. So we took the decision in May to start building the Google Apple version as well. And then because we'd built both, we could then test both. And actually the best way to get new technology going is to test different approaches. And this often happens as a standard approach in the commercial world, for instance, and far better to go with both versions. And we've now got problems with both versions, but there's parts of each that can come together to build something that's stronger than either version there is. Dido?
The reality is, if we hadn't backed both horses, we wouldn't have a way forward. Precisely because we've developed our own and we've developed some really sophisticated distance calculations, we think that we can enhance the Google Apple platform such that it will work. If we hadn't backed both, we wouldn't be able to do that.
Thanks, Heather. The next question is from Matt Dathan at The Sun. Matt.
Thank you. This week you've seen more evidence of how disabled children, their families and adults with learning difficulties have been left behind and let down in lockdown. This week, a survey by the Disabled Children's Partnership found 3/4 of disabled children have had all of their support withdrawn, such as respite care and equipment. And this leaves also a huge strain on their families, their siblings, their parents, and adults with learning difficulties, many of whom live in supported living situations. Like my sister Beth, actually, herself, they want much clearer guidance to help them adjust to the new normal. And they also want to know when they'll be able to see family again. So what measures can the government take going forward to ensure that people with disabilities are no longer forgotten during this pandemic?
Well, Matt, I think that's an incredibly important question. And I've seen the report, and I saw the report in The Sun on this earlier this week. It's an incredibly important question. I think the first thing to say is that even whilst almost all children weren't going to school during the lockdown, we kept 80% of schools open for those with special needs. We have put more support in from central government, including, for instance, the 10 million Family Fund Trust. But it's vital that local authority support that you refer to is also there. And getting that into place as services recover right across the board is incredibly important.
Well, one thing that might help with this is maybe following Northern Ireland's lead, as we hear today. Schools are going to be reducing social distancing to to 1 metre. Why is it so different here? Why can't schools here reduce the social distancing to 1 metre when they reopen in September?
Well, we're working on what is needed to get schools open in September, to get all schools open in September. And there is a review, as you know, Matt, into the current 2 metre rule. But the 2 metre rule is itself a social distancing measure. So removing it has an impact in terms of the transmission of the disease. So we have to make sure in that review that we have the space within and the virus is under control enough to be able to make the change and to replace the 2 metre rule, if that's the conclusion of the review, with something that then makes it easier to do things like, for instance, have people together at school. So I get the interaction between the 2 metre rule and getting people back to school. We're working very hard now, the DFE is leading it, on the work that's needed in order to have all pupils back in school, as everybody wants to see, from the start of September.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on, you didn't quite answer when we might be able to actually visit family and stay overnight. You know, Father's Day on Sunday. Can you give us any hope of when we might be able to start seeing our parents or going to stay overnight?
Look, that is another one of the social distancing measures that we're looking at. Of course, we're looking at it. It's an important consideration, not least because I want people to be able also to have a holiday, if at all possible, this summer. And the rules currently prevent people from staying elsewhere overnight unless they have exceptional circumstances. So that is something that we're looking at, and we'll work on it, and I'll make sure that you know about the outcome of that just as soon as we possibly can. Thanks, Matt. Final question is from Jerry Scott from the Yorkshire Post. Jerry.
Thank you. I'd like to ask how local leaders are supposed to be ready for these local lockdowns we've heard about. We've got directors of public health saying that they don't know what the term means. We've got mayors and council leaders saying that they don't have the powers to enact them on a scale larger than 1 building. And the Joint Biosecurity Centre won't be fully operational until later in the summer. So what happens in the meantime, or are you moving away from the term, as you've just spoken about the outbreak in Yorkshire and said you've put mobile testing in, so our local lockdown is no longer on the table?
Oh yes, the system is already up and running. In fact, I chaired a meeting this morning of our local action committee, which is the formal process through which we make these decisions, working with local leaders. For instance, in Kirklees, as you mentioned, the local director of public health and the council are heavily involved in the response. There are actions and powers that people have at a local level in local councils, and then there's powers that I have as Secretary of State from the Coronavirus Act, and we have a process so that if on the ground they need powers that I have, they can put that request up and we can look at that. And similarly, if we spot a problem, then we can go down to the council and ask what they're doing about it. So that process is in place. And it's up and running and working, and Dido were sat around a table for an hour this morning working on exactly that, including discussing Kirklees. Dido.
I would add that it is a good Yorkshireman, Tom Reardon, the Chief Executive of Leeds City Council, that is leading this work for the Secretary of State and I, and making sure, the government has allocated an additional £300 million to upper tier local authorities to build and enhance their local action plans. And what we're seeing is that communities are doing this now as we speak in a number of places across the country, where we see experts from the Public Health England health protection teams working alongside directors of public health and local authorities. We from NHS Test and Trace are able to allocate out mobile testing units when they need it, to use our contact tracing capacity to do extra contact tracing, and then to work with employers and individuals so that they can take the necessary social distancing, deep cleaning, health protection measures. So there is a lot of work for everyone to do as we all get used to living with COVID. But actually, I think that I really firmly believe that the way to do this is through local communities working together, and that's what Tom and his team are doing.
Thanks very much indeed.
Sorry, can I just have a follow-up?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Sorry, that doesn't change the fact that mayors and council leaders and directors of public health locally across the country are saying they don't actually understand what this is, and they don't feel they have the powers, even if you So they do. So do you feel like you've communicated that well enough to them, and will you issue further guidance?
Well, the local directors of public health, who have the statutory responsibility locally in this area, are the ones who we directly engage with. Of course, where there is a local outbreak, the whole council, including the council leader, the council chief executive, will inevitably get involved if it's significant. But I do think that led by Tom Riordan, who himself is a chief executive of a Yorkshire council in Leeds, we're getting better and better engagement with each local area. And as I said, you can see it on the ground from the example in Kirklees right now. But of course that can, there's more and more councils that we need to engage. But thankfully, in most areas, this isn't necessary. Where it's necessary is where the outbreaks are, and thankfully at the moment they are relatively few. But of course, we work intensively whenever we see one. Thanks very much indeed. That brings to the end our daily coronavirus briefing. Thank you.
The Health Secretary bringing to an end the latest press conference at Downing Street. Let's sum up now the main points from that briefing. The Health Secretary explained that the test and trace system is working well, but that the test and trace app has been delayed due to technical issues and that there's no date set for its release in England as yet. He went on to talk about the vaccine, that when it's ready, adults over 50 and those with heart and kidney disease will be prioritised. He said there were no excess deaths in England last week, meaning that the number of overall deaths were in line with the seasonal average. He also said this is the first time that this has happened since mid-March. Also, there were 135 deaths recorded with a positive coronavirus test in the last day, bringing the total number of deaths to 42,288. Well, our health correspondent, Kath Burns, is here with me and was listening to that briefing. Kath, if we can start first of all on the issue of the app. Lots of questions about it. No surprise, really.
Yeah, lots. So if you think really, Rita, what an app has to do, the contact tracing, it needs to be good at two things. It needs to know who you're with and how long you're with them, how close you are to them. So the government's always wanted its own NHS app, but it turns out that their app is not very good at actually seeing who you're with. And they're blaming Apple for this, saying that Apple technology essentially pushes this app into the background. Then you come on to the Google Apple app, and they're saying, yes, that's better at this, but actually it's not very good at seeing how close you are to someone. So translate this, what does it mean? It means that really neither of them are fit for purpose right now, which then asks, are we going to get an app? When is it going to be? So our health editor, Hugh Pym, asked this and was told, we're not going to give you a date on this. We can't tell you when the technology is going to be ready. The thing that I think is really interesting is the sort of dialing back maybe from even having a contact tracing app. There's more talk now of a companion app to the whole test and trace system. So this would be an app where you could order your test and then over the time you're in self-isolation, get guidance and tips. This is not what we were expecting at the beginning of May.
Really interesting. We heard also the Health Secretary talking about vaccines and where we are with developing and manufacturing vaccines.
Yeah, two really interesting lines on this. He talked about the vaccine coming from Imperial College, saying that they've started human trials. And then also the Oxford vaccine from Oxford University. AstraZeneca has actually started to make that vaccine now, even though it's not been approved, so they can build up a stockpile for when and if it's approved. Also, they talked about who would get vaccines, the priority order. Not surprisingly, health and social care workers are going to be top of that list. Also, though, people who are seen at risk. I thought it was quite interesting that they said adults over 50. It wasn't 60 or 70, 50, which is pretty young, really. They also said they'll look at other risk factors, for example, ethnic minority backgrounds. And the reason this is so important, Matt Hancock said, the best way to defeat this is to get a vaccine. And even now, weeks into this, when we're talking about relatively successful figures, 135 deaths were recorded. And the youngest of those is a 13-day-old baby. It shows how vital this really is.
Very sad. OK, thank you very much. Kath Burns there, our health correspondent. Well, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, is in Westminster and was also listening to all of that briefing. So many questions about that app, Vicky. And Matt Hancock saying that the government backed both horses, the NHS app and the Apple Google app. But the fact is that neither of them is ready.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really uncomfortable time for Matt Hancock. He is the one really who's talked about this as being a central part of the test and trace system. Boris Johnson, too, just a month ago, talking about a world-beating system that would be, yes, in place by the 1st of June. So we've gone from that to what they're now describing as basically a human tracing system, which will be digitally assisted. So all sorts of questions here. And also there were issues being raised about all of this quite some time ago, from the beginning of May, I think, or maybe even earlier, issues about how this was going to work. Now, the government would say that that's the point of trialling this, of piloting it. They did that on the Isle of Wight. They wanted to make sure that it works. But the fact that there is now no date, I think partly because they know that you're just setting yourself up each time to be judged against something which might not be so easy to deliver. But I think probably the broader issue here is that people watching it will have heard the promises and now they're not being delivered. Now, there could be very good reason for that, but I think it just doesn't help with people's confidence, particularly as we're coming out of lockdown. And this was seen to be one of the ways that you would be able to safely unlock and lift some of those restrictions, because you would have this world-beating system in place, which meant that you could trace people with coronavirus and those that they'd contacted very quickly and very easily in order to maybe have local lockdowns.
It is, as you say, a very difficult situation and an unprecedented one. But given these setbacks, and this is the latest in a series of U-turns that the government has had to make, how would you assess the mood amongst Conservative backbenchers?
I mean, I think they're a bit concerned about all of this. I mean, of course, lots of MPs will be looking at this and accepting this is an unprecedented time. Ministers and departments across Whitehall are dealing with an awful lot. And we have got used to this over the months, haven't we? But we shouldn't forget that a lot of this is unprecedented, not just the health side of this, but the economic crisis as well. So all of that is very difficult. But I think the point there is that sometimes ministers haven't helped themselves by using rhetoric, which even at the time, I think lots of us watching would have thought, well, you know, that really is quite a big ask, and then not being able to fulfill it. That maybe being a bit more modest about what they could deliver would have been a better idea, particularly because other countries are having similar problems. I mean, it's not just the UK that's having a problem with this app. There are problems elsewhere, but, you know, maybe they should have learnt from some of that rather than suggesting that they could come up with something that others haven't managed to do.
OK, many thanks. Vicky Young there, our chief political correspondent at Westminster. Now, ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive have agreed social distancing of 1 metre is safe and appropriate for children and young people at school. New guidance outlines how schools may operate when they fully reopen. It's understood the reopening date is August the 24th. Speaking at the country's daily briefing, the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster, outlined the latest steps to easing the lockdown in the country.
We have been advised today that the R rate is currently between 0.6 and 0.9. The virus continues to be controlled and the number of new cases remains small. This has allowed the Executive to take a number of further decisions today. We have agreed that places of worship should plan on the basis of reopening from week beginning the 29th of June. The Executive will confirm this date next Thursday, dependent on the virus remaining under control. We can also announce, based on the scientific and medical advice, that hairdressers, barbers and nail bars can aim to open provisionally from Monday the 6th of July. The Executive has also agreed a proposal from the Health Minister that those who are shielding are to be advised that they can pause shielding from the 31st of July.
The Bank of England is pumping an additional £100 billion into the financial system because of the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. The bank will create new money to buy British government bonds, an expansion of its policy known as quantitative easing. The pub chain Greene King and Lloyd's of London insurers have apologised for past links to the slave trade. They've both said they will donate to charities representing black and minority ethnic groups. Lloyd's once insured slave ships, and one of Greene King's founders owned plantations in the Caribbean. Well, we heard Dame Vera Lynn touching upon her visits to Burma to entertain British troops in our report before the news conference began. Let's hear a little more from her now. She began her own radio programme on BBC Forces in the early 1940s. And here she talks about her impromptu concerts using aeroplane cases or the back of a lorry to form a stage.
I just had a sort of station wagon, a driver, a pianist, a piano and microphone, and off we would go. And of course, our little impromptu concerts were just put up anywhere, maybe in a casualty clearing station or just on a spot of grass that happened to be empty at the time, and that would take a few aeroplane engine cases that would make a stage or back of a lorry, and the amount would vary from 2 to 6,000.
Oh, gracious. And how many songs did you sing at one concert, for example?
Oh, we didn't limit ourselves. We just sort of staggered on, you know. We thought we couldn't do any more. And of course there was a lot of visiting hospitals too. This came into it not just as much as singing, you know. They just like to see you and like to know that you came out all that way just to see them.
In a moment, we'll have the weather with Helen Willits. But before we go, let's return to events in central London this afternoon, where the French President Emmanuel Macron was welcomed to the UK with a ceremony of pomp and pageantry as he marked the 80th anniversary of General Charles de Gaulle's famous wartime broadcast. The President lay a wreath with Prince Charles at the foot of General de Gaulle's statue in Carlton Gardens before Mr Macron was joined by Boris Johnson for a flypast over central London by the Red Arrows and their counterparts, La Patrouille de France. We will leave you with those images.
Hello there. Some parts of southeast England have had their month's worth of rain through the night and the first half of today. That rain will start to clear away from the southeast, but actually across Scotland and Northern Ireland, we've got far fewer showers around and more sunshine, as you saw there, for Perth and Kinross. And it is brightening across the eastern side of England, the Midlands up into Lincolnshire, East Anglia, but that's going to produce some really intense thunderstorms in this part of the world as well. Like we've been talking about in recent days, they're slow moving and they're giving a lot of rain, but this is giving a lot of rain as well, and it's quite heavy. It could produce the odd rumble of thunder across the southwest into Wales, meandering its way north across northern England, perhaps producing a few thunderstorms in Northern Ireland and towards the end of the day across southern Scotland. But for much of Scotland, away from the east coast, plagued by that misty low cloud, there's plenty of sunshine and it's warm, 23, 24 potentially. That low cloud comes back in overnight. The thundery rain potentially comes into Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, and we've got the rain hanging around across southern and western areas. So a warm night again and quite a murky one as we head towards dawn on Friday. And then there's quite a lot of cloud mixed around on Friday. There'll be outbreaks of rain, turning more thundery, I think, as we go through the day and we push that June sunshine into the mix. So probably more likely across northern England, Northern Ireland and Scotland compared with today, but they could break out just about anywhere. But there should be more sunshine in between further south, so feeling warmer than it has today. Then it's all changed for the weekend. We've still got low pressure. There's still more rain, but it's coming in off the Atlantic, so it's a fresher wind. You can see the tightly packed isobars. So it will be a windier spell this weekend, but we lose the humidity. Instead, we'll still have temperatures around about average. It'll feel pleasant in the sunshine and there'll be fewer showers on Saturday. It looks as if the rain will still hold off for most until later in the day, but for Northern Ireland it does arrive here and the southwest. Of course, 18 to 20 is not too far shy of what we've seen this week, but it will feel fresher, the breeze part of that equation as well. Then through the night on Saturday, that rain pushes its way across many areas, so good dose of rain for the garden for many, and then showers follow on around that area of low pressure into Sunday. But again, some places in the south and the east escape, and pretty warm here, but blustery and showery in the northwest.